Story 1. In high school, they would do trivia questions after the announcement sometimes, and the first teacher who dialed the office with the correct answer would get a prize for the class. My math teacher really wanted to win, and hadn't yet this year. So one fateful morning, the question went out, and we had the answer, so he called in, but we were the second caller. In a fit of pseudo rage, he yells, "Damn it!" and kicks this little plastic trash can across the room, where it bonks a kid right in the head. His eyes go wide, and he apologizes and asks if the kid is okay, which he is. Everyone got a good laugh afterwards, including the kid who got hit, and later we would pretend to duck whenever we didn't win the morning trivia contests. Story 2. I had a history teacher in high school who was always stern and serious, which was great since it gave a reverence to what he was teaching about. And his unpretentious nature meant he spoke about what was important and interesting. One day, however, his voice broke, and after he cleared his throat, it broke again. He stopped talking, put his hands in his pockets, frowned, and took a few breaths. "Students, sorry about this lecture. My wife and I just decided to get a divorce." He blankly stared ahead for a second and then walked toward the door, loosening his tie. "I need a drink." He exited the door. After a second, he poked his head back in. "Of water. I'm coming back. Don't think I've forgotten about Napoleon." Not too much of a meltdown, but he was a pretty manly dude in a nerdy sort of way. Story 3. Our freshman English teacher was a small, soft-spoken woman who was kind of known to be a teacher you could walk all over with little repercussions. We were in a review session after school, and some upperclassmen were just hanging out in the hallways making lots of noise. So she was constantly poking her head out in the hall, asking them to be quiet. As we are all very silently reading or something, the classroom door absolutely slammed shut, so hard the latch didn't have time to catch, and the door bounced back open. The teacher immediately yells, "Oh, hell no," and kicks off her heels and takes off out the door. She caught up with the kid, who had taken a running start and kicked the door shut, and berated him for a good 10 minutes, which we could hear clear as day from the end of the hall. It was like nothing we'd ever heard from her. Story 4. I was in a band. One day, one of the regular always in trouble disruptive students was being extra disruptive while the director was trying to tell us something important. So after about 5 different times of going the normal route to get him to settle down, he cracked. It got quiet, and then the director bellowed, "William, are you stupid or just don't give a crap?" The whole room was quiet. All eyes were now on the disruptive kid who was then trying to hide behind his tuba. Then the director continued with his announcement like nothing happened. Story 5. My super dorky history teacher in 8th grade was the nicest teacher I've ever met. But there were a couple class clowns in our class, and he usually dealt with them okay. One day, though, they were obnoxious to the entire class from the moment he walked in, and he snapped, yelling and chucking his stapler across the room. He nailed a staple right into Ben Franklin's forehead. He immediately apologized and went about his day normally, while all the students went silent. Nobody ever bothered him again after that day. Story 6. A Spanish teacher I had in high school ended up having a meltdown on the day of the final exam. The whole semester, my class had been pretty chatty, but really nothing that out of the ordinary. On the day of the final, there was an event that set her off. If I remember correctly, he was talking during the exam. His cell phone may have gone off instead, it's been a while. She proceeded to attempt to pick up the desk with a 17-year-old sitting in it and slam it on the ground. The kid got up, and then she flung the desk along the floor, slamming it against the door, and told him to finish his exam outside. Then she proceeded to tell the rest of us what terrible people and students we were. She also told us that she had gained 20 pounds over the course of the semester because of how bad our class was. Then she felt the need to tell us about how she'd been raped as she broke down sobbing. After that, I just did my best to finish my exam as quickly as possible so that I could go home, as that was my last class of the year before summer. Story 7. Junior year of high school, I decided to take a psychology class. The administration switched a lot of teachers around that year and hired a lot of new ones too, so I didn't know anything about him. As the semester goes on, his behavior starts slipping, and the class starts noticing. He begins to lose his patience more and more frequently when the class doesn't respond to a question immediately. His behavior then progressed to him throwing whiteboard markers at students for not paying attention or answering incorrectly. Then one day, about half the way into the semester, he completely loses it. A group of 3 students laughed at something within their own conversation just as class was starting, and our teacher saw and made a comment to the class that if we weren't going to listen, he would make today hell. Some kids spoke up, saying he would go to the principal if he did anything to hurt the class. So the teacher began throwing markers, erasers, anything he could find at the student. The student got up to leave for the principal's, and the teacher stood up on his desk and screamed at us. He ran to the front of the classroom, where the student who spoke out was, picked up a desk and threw it at the student. Thankfully, it didn't hit him, but the teacher ran to the door to prevent anyone from leaving, and said if anyone said anything about that day to anyone, he would ruin their lives. Some friends and I told the principal and administration, and I actually had to go into court to testify. Turns out, the guy suffers from schizophrenia as well as some degree of PTSD after serving in the military. I don't remember what ended up happening with him. At the time, I really didn't care to know. Bummer. I really wanted to hear this end with something like, at the end of the semester, he tied his erratic behavior to a lesson plan. Some kind of Dead Poet Society or something. We had a physics teacher in 11th grade that fake reversed graded the first big exam. All the smart kids did bad, didn't understand why, and the couple broke down. He quickly blended that into the next lesson and handed out the proper grades at the end of the class. Was a total mind F. Story 8. Junior year in university, my genetics professor was in the middle of a lecture when authorities took him out of the auditorium, thank goodness, and informed him that his wife, the dean of our college, had been struck and killed by a motor vehicle that morning. He retreated to his office and proceeded to tear the place apart like a tornado had gone through it. He ripped the top of his desk off its frame, pulled down all of his bookcases, books, pages, papers, all sorts of documents and furniture strewn everywhere in pieces. By the time I graduated, he still wasn't the same man as he was before that awful day. Story 9. This was in high school. We had a band teacher. His nickname was Pinky because he had very red hair and pale skin with a red tint, borderline albino. Every time he got mad, his entire face turned tomato red. I don't remember the sequence of events, but he was already frustrated. Everyone in the room knew to shut up so that we didn't piss him off. Well, everyone except this one dippy girl. She asked something along the lines of, "Are you mad?" and kept pestering him. He finally snapped. His face turned that familiar shade of tomato red, and he threw the pencil he was using to conduct across the room. He then stormed out and slammed the door hard enough that it could be heard on the other side of the building. He quit soon after. Story 10. Year 9 math class. Our teacher was sick, and an early 20s substitute teacher came in to cover. She was lovely, kind, friendly, although a bit timid and shy. One girl in our class used a fountain pen to flick ink on a shirt she was wearing one day. Poor woman noticed her do it, didn't say a word, and just went to her desk, put her head in her hands, and sobbed. Didn't even move for 10 minutes at least. Eventually, a friend of mine went to get another teacher. The sub was escorted out, still crying, and was seen for the rest of the day just crying in her car, not moving for another 4 or so hours. Story 11. 8th grade math teacher. He was well known for his short temper, but this particular day was bad. There was a kid in my class, Justin, that never listened and never did his homework. One day, the math teacher just had it with Justin, grabbed his desk with him in it, and picked it up and slammed it back down on the ground a few times. After that, he shoved the desk with Justin in it across the room. Justin was fine, thankfully, but the math teacher just stormed out. Told my mom, and I guess a few other parents called the school about it too. He was gone for a few weeks and had to take anger management classes. I just went by my old middle school a few weeks ago, and he's the assistant principal now. Who would have expected that? Story 12. In high school, our government teacher freaked out on my class. We had a few talkers in the back corner, but they finally broke him. He flipped his podium lectern over and started screaming at us. He called us the worst group of kids he'd ever had to teach, and that he was 110% accurate that we were going to be nothing. He then went to his desk and drank his entire thermos of coffee. A few years later, he was having a retirement party at his house. I was close friends with his son. He revealed that the thermos was 80% vodka and 20% coffee. Story 13. Had a sub in 5th grade. I was a really unorganized kid, and having to dig through my desk for crap wasn't uncommon. Sub went to collect our homework one by one, and I was still digging through, pulling a bunch of stuff out when she got to me. She started towering over me and told me this was unacceptable, dumped my desk in front of me and told me I was staying in from recess to organize it. One girl said, "You can't make him do that." And the sub raised her voice and spit out, "You don't tell me what to do, brat. I can do whatever I want." The whole class revolted, and a neighboring teacher came in to see what was up. The sub claimed I was being lippy, and this was my punishment. Then the whole class spoke up and informed him of what really happened, and we were all let out for recess. Came back in, and a lunch lady was sitting at the teacher's desk instead. As the kid who was always picked on by everyone, it was nice to see the whole class stand up for me that day. Story 14. I taught public high school for 7 years and have been teaching in a university ever since. Every time one of these threads pops up, I expect to find the story of how I once broke down in tears when a cell phone rang in class. Or the time I threw up in a trash can, brushed my teeth with bottled water in front of all 42 students, asked a janitor to come down and take the trash out, and went back to teaching after my favorite student of all time faked barfing noises because he knew it would make me puke. Story 15. My junior year in nursing school, we took a nursing psych class. The professor was not a good teacher, to put it lightly. She regularly would talk about her personal life instead of teaching what was outlined on the syllabus. About halfway through the course, we had our midterm exam, which consisted of about 75% of questions of stuff we had not covered in class. I think the highest grade anyone got was a 65%. The next class, she berated us and told us all we were going to be bad nurses. One of the people in my class wrote a letter to her, saying that she spends most of the classes not teaching the material, and it's not justifiable to give us exams if we know more about her personal life than what we are supposed to be taught, citing the syllabus given to us at the beginning of the semester. All of us in the course signed the letter. Next class, she absolutely lost it on us, screaming at us about how disrespectful we are and how we will never amount to anything. This got to the point that the dean of the nursing program heard her from down the hall and had to come remove her from the classroom. Next class, we had another professor for the rest of the semester. The dean told us she was on hiatus and said that we brought up our grievances in a respectful manner and commended us on that. The professor who broke down never came back to teach at the school. Story 16. I was bullied a lot around this time, and I started fighting back against the bullies. The teacher noticed this and thought it'd be a good idea to remove me, and who is essentially my arch nemesis, from the playground during lunch, and make us do crafts in a classroom instead. I think they were trying to make us get along by working together, but that doesn't happen with 11-year-olds. Unsupervised for a whole hour in a locked classroom. She leaves, and when she returns halfway through the hour, the classroom is a mess, chairs strewn everywhere, our school jumpers and shirts are torn. I had a bleeding ear and he had a swollen lip and bruises everywhere. We freeze as soon as she catches us, and she just collapses to the ground. She sobbed into her hands. "All I wanted was for you to be friends. Was that so much to ask?" She wept uncontrollably for the next 5 minutes. We felt awful about it. We shook hands and tried to clean up the classroom. The next day, we had a substitute teacher, who eventually became our permanent one, and he was horrible. I guess it worked though. It's 16 years later, and I'm on the way to my enemy's house to drink and play board games. So, yeah. Story 17. My 8th grade algebra teacher, also German teacher, Mr. Cogburn, was an interesting guy. He was tall, had kind of wild-looking frizzy gray hair and a beard, and had a sort of boisterous, larger-than-life kind of personality. He started every single class by slamming the door and yelling. He yelled, or as I would realize once I got into theater in high school, he projected, through the entire class period, though he never really came across as intimidating. He always had a yardstick in his hand that he would slap forcefully against the blackboard to emphasize what he was saying. He would also slap it against the desks of students who weren't paying attention, though he was exceedingly careful to not actually hit the student. It wasn't terribly uncommon for him to break yardsticks, and there was always another one in the supply cabinet to replace the one he'd broken. He had a little song/chant he made up for remembering the slope-intercept form of an equation for a line that I will probably remember until the day I die. He also gave the most effective, and to 8th graders both hilarious and embarrassing, explanation of how to divide fractions. He stood on a desk and told us, "Always divide the top." He pointed at his head. "By the bottom." He then turned around and pointed at his own ass. "Never divide the bottom because the bottom," here he helpfully gestured up and down the length of his ass, "is already divided." That's what Mr. Cogburn was like. He was big and loud and crazy, but not in a scary way. We told new students that the way to tell he was actually mad was if he started the class by shutting the door like a normal person and speaking quietly, and that was when they should be scared. Now we get to the story of the meltdown. Every year, our school did an event called the Mathathon. Students were given math worksheets and tried to solve as many problems as they could in a set amount of time. People, usually the parents, would sponsor the students, pledging a certain amount of money for each problem correctly solved, and at the end, the money was donated to a local charity that helps the disabled. It was that time of year, and Mr. Cogburn was explaining the mathathon to my class. And when he got to the part about the charity and what they did, one boy, who probably thought himself incredibly cool and edgy, loudly said, "I don't know why anyone bothers to help those tards. We should just let them all die." And Mr. Cogburn transformed. As I said before, dude was tall, well over 6 feet, but his height never came across as imposing at all. Now, he loomed over that student's desk like the freaking angel of death. He seemed to physically radiate pure rage. I swear to all that's holy, you could feel his outrage coming off of him in waves. Even though he was focused solely on the one boy, students halfway across the room sank down in their chairs in pure terror, trying to disappear under their desks. I know because I was one of them. We couldn't even look at him, not out of the usual crap he's mad, don't make eye contact instinct most people have, but more like it was a form of physical protection. He was a burning sun of anger, and if we looked directly at that sun, it would blind us. He spoke very, very quietly to the boy for about a minute. I didn't make out what he said. Then he led the kid out of the room and shut the door. About a quarter of the class started crying as soon as he left. After a while, the other math teacher came in and taught for the rest of the period. What we all found out later, and which none of us, including that boy, had known, was that Mr. Cogburn's daughter, who he spoke about to us frequently enough, was not his only child. He and his wife had also had a son that was born extremely physically disabled, and who had died at a very young age from health complications arising from those disabilities. When he took that student out of the room, I think we all thought that he was going to kill him. He actually just took him down to the principal and explained what the kid had said, and the kid was suspended for a day. Mr. Cogburn also took the rest of the day off. So that was the biggest meltdown I have ever seen from a teacher, and it was sort of the inverse of a normal meltdown. When he was shouting, gesticulating wildly, and hitting our desks with yardsticks, we loved the guy and feared nothing. But that day when he got so quiet, we felt mortal effing terror.